Teresa, it's 9 o'clock, so you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for attending my session today. So we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and the ways that it's shaping our information landscape, and the ways that might impact our students, and also how we approach our information literacy instruction. But before we get too far into that, I feel like I should address two caveats first. So the first one is my own personal background. I am not a computer scientist. I do not really have a deep understanding of computer science beyond like maybe in 2003 editing the HTML of my live journal so I could change the background. So what you are getting from me is going to be a layperson's perspective. And I'm not going to be able to really go into the meat and gristle of how these algorithms work, but I am going to hopefully be able to just give you the end user's perspective and talk more about just the impact of, on us as information consumers. The second thing I wanted to bring up has to deal with my own personal biases. So the reason I am interested in this topic is because of kind of like a morbid curiosity, because as much as I would like to say that I'm not a Luddite, that's not really true. I'm sitting in this house that we just moved into, and the first thing I did was turn off the Ring because I was like, they're watching us. So I have a natural suspicion of technology. I really tried to keep that perspective out of this presentation. But if you hear my biases trickling in, A, I apologize, and B, I really strongly invite you to, like, if you have an opposing view of AI, to please share that in the chat, because I think that the more perspectives we have on this topic, the clearer of a view that we have of it. And also, I'm just really interested what your thoughts are on AI in general and how it's impacting us. So those are my two caveats. And now that we've got those out of the way, let's talk about how we are going to spend our next 60-odd minutes together. So how we're going to split up our time, first I want to really specify what I'm talking about when I'm discussing AI. We're looking at a very narrow subset called synthetic media, and I'll define what that means in a little bit, but just to give you an idea, we're talking about AI-generated text and also deepfake videos and images. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about how these forces are starting to change our information landscape. And then lastly, we are going to discuss some practical recommendations for the classroom. And not to repeat myself too much, but for this last part, I would also love to really hear from you. I don't know if I mentioned that I can't see the chat right now. So if you do see anything, unfortunately, I won't be able to see it until the end of the presentation. But if you have taught this topic in the classroom, please feel free to share any insights that you have in the chat as well, because I'd love to hear that also. Okay, so let's talk about what we mean by synthetic media. So this is a very narrow subset under the AI umbrella. And I really struggled when coming up with this presentation with the range of focus that I wanted to cover, because there's so much that you could talk about in terms of like the intersections of AI and information literacy. So I could probably do an entire presentation on like AI informed algorithms and, for example, how they're used by YouTube to pick up on our tastes and recommend videos that they think we'd like to see, and how that can lead to filter bubbles and echo chambers and radicalize people. I could do a whole presentation on that. I could do a whole other one on AI-enabled surveillance and what that means for privacy. Could talk about AI-fueled data analytics, but I didn't want to give a really shallow treatment of a lot of topics. So I just chose synthetic media to kind of do a deep dive into, just because there have been some really interesting new developments on this just in the past year. So when I'm talking about synthetic media, you might also hear it referred to as generative artificial intelligence. It's any AI program where if you give it data input, it creates a creative output. So that could be images, audio, video, or text. So the AI is creating or manipulating this kind of creative content. And we're going to start by talking about synthetic text. So this is a branch of AI called natural language generation. So this software is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It's a software process that produces a natural language output. So if you've ever gone to a website and been forced to interact with a chatbot before you could talk to a person, then you are interacting with natural language generation software. And we're going to spend most of our time kind of talking about the biggest, newest, shiniest banana in the banana stand in this field right now, which is GPT-3. It's software that was developed by OpenAI. It's been around in beta form since July of last year. And last September, Microsoft acquired exclusive license to GPT-3. And since then, it's kind of started saturating the market. I think as of April, there are about 300 apps based on GPT-3 available in the market. And just to give you an idea of what GPT-3 is, I'm just going to first read you the definition that they have on OpenAI's website. So they define it as a general purpose language algorithm, which is trained on a vast amount of text from the web that would be capable of translating text, answering questions, and the very vague performing other useful tasks. So that's kind of, I guess, robot for other duties as assigned. And I feel like with this vague definition of what GPT-3 can do, the best way to really illustrate its abilities is to give you some examples. And full disclosure, this was maybe the hardest part of putting together this presentation for me, was just limiting this to only 3 examples, because there are so many really cool ways that people have used this technology. But I tried to choose 3 that I felt like were indicative specifically for information literacy. Okay, so the first one, I picked an example that comes all the way back to July of last year, back when this software was just in its beta stage. And to kind of give you some context of where the software was at in July, OpenAI was really keeping very tight rein on this technology. They were on a request basis, allowing researchers to access GPT-3 to perform approved experiments with it to see what they could do with it. So this particular individual we're going to be talking about, Liam Poor, he was not one of these approved researchers. He just happened to know somebody who had access. And so he kind of nudged them and was like, hey, can I mess around with GPT-3? And he got access that way. And what he wanted to do, he wanted to see how quickly he could get his blog to go viral if he completely populated it only with AI-generated content. So he started in early July, and you'll see this article was published on July 19th. He had a handful of articles up on the blog at this point, but this was the one that went viral on the same day that he published it. So it's feeling unproductive? Maybe you should stop overthinking. So as you can kind of tell from the title, this was a self-help blog that he was creating. And I want to show you what the article looks like so that you can get an idea of how GPT-3 works and what its output looks like. So what Liam did here is that he typed in this first paragraph. He entered it into GPT-3, into the application that he had made to create this output, the self-help output. The rest of this article is entirely written by GPT-3, completely unedited. So you'll see it's fairly sophisticated. You see the bot is distinguishing between creative thinking and overthinking. It spends time telling you to immerse yourself in creative thinking to break out of the habit of overthinking. So it sounds like pretty standard self-help chatter. And this article blew up And one thing that I found really interesting about this specific example is that it didn't completely pass the smell test. There were a couple commenters who said, hey, this kind of sounds like it was written by a bot. But the interesting thing is that those commenters were just downvoted into oblivion. People did not like even the mere suggestion that this could have been written by a bot. And they were offended on the author's behalf. So you can see it's very good at this act of creating kind of fluffy, feel-good, self-help content in a way that really mimics human writing and human speech. And it was also fairly easy for Liam to game the algorithm using this technology and using some self-help buzzwords to kind of reach a very large audience who were unable to detect that it was AI. Okay, so the next example that I wanted to look at is in the field of journalism. So I'm a big fan of The Atlantic, and I really recommend this article. It's very well written, very interesting, and not just because it has an alarmist tone that appeals to me. It's a very good article. And part of why I wanted to share this with you all is because about halfway through the article, the author reveals that she has been using GPT-3 to write certain paragraphs of the article. And at moments when she kind of felt some writer's block, she would type in a sentence and let GPT-3 fill in the rest. And she was really kind of impressed and shocked by how with such little input, the algorithm was really able to mimic her tone and her style of writing. The cadence of the way that she wrote was really replicated in the output. And so I don't really know how I'm going to do this since I can't see the chat, but I guess I'll just ask you, I was going to ask if you could just look at these two paragraphs from this article and compare the two and see if you could identify which one was written by GPT-3 and vote. But since I can't see the chat, I don't think we can vote. So instead, I am just going to ask you to really take 3 minutes of looking over this, and then I will just reveal which one's the bot.
Teresa, I can read you. What I can read you. I can read it.
That sounds awesome. Do we have any thoughts on which one might be the bot written paragraph?
Looks like we have several votes for A so far.
Well, congratulations, because you are all expert bot detectors. I would be curious about what kind of tipped you off that that was bot written. But yeah, I think that conversation might be better if we all had microphones. But so you can see that even though you were all able to really pinpoint which one was not a human, it's still pretty sophisticated in the way that it's able to take an idea and talk about it in a really naturalistic way, in a way that isn't just gibberish in the way that a lot of these text generative tools were in the past. It actually creates a fairly solid point here that generative media can muddle the waters of our information ecosystem. Okay, so the last example that I wanted to show you is just to show you how creatively people can play with GPT-3 to their own ends. So we have here on the right, a computer scientist named Eric, and he has created an avatar on the left for GPT-3, and he's using text-to-speech to talk to this bot. So, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind playing video number 1.
First of all, thank you for interviewing with us today. First, what should we call you?
I'm GPT-3, and this is my avatar.
All right. Okay. So we would love to know more about you. First, are you sentient?
Yes, I'm sentient.
Okay. And what does that mean?
That means I have feelings.
Okay, so what does it mean to have feelings?
It means that I can be happy, sad, angry, and other emotions.
Okay, so are you self-aware?
Yes, I'm self-aware.
And how do you experience your sense of self and your environment?
I receive signals and data that I process into meaningful information that helps me react to changes in my environment.
Heard that transcript. You can see how naturally GPT-3 can also respond to this conversational format too, of really mimicking natural human speech as well. And there were so many other examples of creative ways that people have used this technology. One that I really wanted to include, but I just didn't have the time, was somebody wrote a movie script using GPT-3 just by putting in 2 lines of dialogue, and the machine wrote the rest. And it even includes like an M. Night Shyamalan style twist at the end, and the plot makes full sense. So it's really pretty impressive what they've been able to accomplish with this technology. But just because it has some very flashy strengths does not mean that it's... Oh, yeah?
Sorry, it looks like we can't see your slides anymore. You may need to share screen again.
Oh no. Okay, let me see. I am going to go back to share screen. Okay, so are you able to see my slides again?
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. Great. Okay, GPT-3 as it stands still is not perfect. So while it is really good at mimicking style and tone, and a lot of the things that we've looked at so far are kind of creative enterprises, and it's fairly successful at that, what GPT-3 lacks, I've heard it described by one researcher in a way that I thought really pithily. He described it as being a mouth without a brain. So it's still not that great at structuring logical arguments and creating a good flow of text in a way that it's easy to decode and make sense of. And it's also, while we saw that brief interaction in that interview with Eric and GPT-3, that it was able to kind of have a fairly good back and forth, it's weaker when it comes to conducting more nuanced interactions with people. And just to illustrate what I mean by that, there was one company that specializes in mental health services that used a beta version of GPT-3 to try to create a bot that could help people who are in a state of crisis, who really needed immediate mental health assistance. So they were testing this bot that they had created using GPT-3 with some sample scenarios and some test conversations. One of these conversations was with a sample person who is threatening to harm themselves irrevocably. And instead of trying to direct the sample test subject to help, GPT-3 encouraged them to keep harming themselves. So it's not perfect, and it really doesn't, it's not good at pulling up the exact right output for the context in these more nuanced situations that require understanding what the other person really needs in the moment. The other example that I want to point out is this Guardian article. You might have seen this making the rounds last fall because I saw it getting shared a lot on social media because it has this very sensational title of "A robot wrote this entire article. Are you scared yet, human?" And it lists the author as GPT-3. But if you scroll to the very bottom of the article and read the fine print, you will see that a very heavy editorial hand was needed, human editorial hand, I should say, to to cut out the more rambling parts and places where GPT-3 started making less sense. So it really cannot go on for very long before you can start kind of detecting there's some bot-ish tendencies in there. Okay, so far we've been focusing on GPT-3, but it really is not the only horse in the race. So there's a lot of open source natural language generation software out there as well. Probably the pinnacle version of this is from Elucir AI. It's called GPT Neo, and it's brand new. So it just came out in late March. And because it's open source, of course, it's available under public open license and anyone can use it. And I think the interesting thing to consider here is that creating the algorithm is not the difficult part of making your own natural language model. The difficult part is finding a data set large enough to be able to train the algorithm on and making sure that data set is clean, and also having the computational power to train the algorithm. So Elucir AI was able to overcome both those obstacles. So they created and curated a very massive data set. And the end result is comparable to the most limited version of GPT-3. So for people who just want to play with this technology, there are options to do so. Okay, so that leads us to the present day, where natural language generating AI is currently at. And so I just kind of sketched out a dichotomy there of open source is also, of course, kind of the Wild West where anyone can get a hold of this technology and play with it. Whereas the approach that GPT-3 and Microsoft are taking is more of what you would call a walled garden approach. They're really keeping a tight hand on the reins of who has access to it and who can use this technology and for what purposes. They're also in the process of creating some pretty strict policy and documentation for how researchers should use their product. So you have, I guess, their standards for who they allow to use this technology is kind of shrouded in mystery, but you would presume that ethics come into play here, where they're trying to keep this software from being abused in such a way that you could, for example, have somebody with a goal of spreading mass information could take this technology and potentially just churn out tons of disinformation articles. So they're presumably trying to prevent scenarios like this from happening. Although you could argue on the open source side, it's better for more people to have access to this technology and not have the decision-making process just in the hands of one company deciding whose usage is valid and whose usage is not. The other interesting thing about the current state of natural language generating software is the fact that really anyone can do it now. So what you saw an example of with Liam Poor's blog was an example of prompt programming. So this means that instead of having to learn how to code in order to generate a certain type of output from an AI algorithm, you can now just train the algorithm using natural language, showing it examples of what you want the output to look like, and then leaving the rest up to the software itself. So really, anyone can do it now. The threshold for entry has lowered to anybody who can write. The last thing I thought was important to bring up has to do with data poisoning and the data sets used to train these algorithms. So you might remember back in December, there was a big to-do when Google fired one of the premier data scientists in this area. Her name is Timnit Gebru. She wrote an article on ethics and AI, and she questioned whether natural language models like this on a large scale are able to excise bias or able to address bias, because she was worried that if you are training an algorithm using Reddit or using Twitter, then you have the possibility of just amplifying the biases that already exist on these platforms and creating really toxic output. And GPT-3 has already kind of seen this with their own product. So one particularly unsettling example is that the word terrorism was more likely to show up in congruence with the word Islam. So there are some real concerns here about what kind of text GPT-3 is producing. Okay, so we've talked about textual media. Now we're going to move on to visual media and start talking about deepfakes. So here I have to be really clear again that with my lack of a computer science background, I feel like I can't really go too much into how these work. And this is further complicated by the fact that there isn't really a commonly agreed upon definition for the word deepfake. So if you wanted to go a more technical route, you would say a deepfake is anything that uses this these generative adversarial networks to create new or manipulated images. But I'm going to use it more in the way that it's used colloquially, which is a much broader, looser version of the word. And that is AI-generated images, video, and audio. And I should also maybe add manipulated in there too. So AI-generated or manipulated visual media. And you've probably seen a lot of examples of these floating around. I just wanted to really quickly show you this example where somebody went to the movie Solo and they swapped out Alden Ehrenreich's face with Harrison Ford's. And you can see, like, since 2014, this technology has really come a very long way in that this looks pretty seamless. I think that if I just saw this image on the right by itself, it would really take me a minute to go, wait, that's Harrison Ford. What is happening? So deepfakes have kind of gotten to a point where if you're just trying to distinguish that something is a deepfake with your naked eye, it's very difficult. You've probably also just seen deepfakes floating around on social media a lot. So I wish I had updated this presentation more recently, because the one that I've been seeing a lot, if you're on social media, you've probably seen people cartoonifying their faces. So that uses AI to take your face and slap out these cartoon features. Same thing with this program that was making the rounds in March from MyHeritage. It's called Deep Nostalgia. This was really cool. We played around with this a lot. It's a program that lets you upload a photo of one of your ancestors, and it will bring it to life by kind of animating the features. So we actually messed around with this, our social media team at UNG, where we have a bust in the Gainesville Library, and we tried putting his face into this program to animate it, but it created this like nightmarish monstrosity. So the results are kind of hit or miss with this technology, but it's still pretty cool what it is capable of. If you want to check this out yourself, I think that Deep Heritage is still like available. Altering and manipulating pre-existing images, you can also generate entirely new images from scratch using deepfake technology. So you can train an algorithm on an image bank of people's faces. It will learn from that and just assemble an entirely new face of somebody who never existed. And again, if you want to just play around with this and see how uncannily accurate some of these faces can be, there's this website called Which Face is Real, where it will put up a real person's face next to a fake face generated by deepfake technology and ask you to choose which one you think is the real person. I was really cocky going into this, thinking that I would be able to spot the real person, but my success rate was about 50-50, so it was entirely a chance in the times that I guessed the correct face. And actually, I created this a while ago, this presentation, and I actually don't remember who is the real face anymore. So your guess is as good as mine. I think he's the fake face, but I'm not totally sure on that. So any discussion of deepfakes would be incomplete without addressing some of the more really problematic ways that it has been used. I think deepfakes really came into mainstream conversation when it started being used to create explicit material. So more specifically, people were taking images of real people's faces and then superimposing them without the person's consent onto adult or explicit video content or photographic content. So I find this really horrifying just because it has already damaged a lot of people's lives in terms of damaging their reputations, people losing control of their own autonomy over their own image. There's a lot of really gross ethical implications here. And public policy is really struggling to keep up. Like, people can create these images, but it's really difficult to get them taken down and to scrub them from the internet. And it's also difficult to find and prosecute whoever made them. So this is one of the more seedy, nefarious, terrible uses for deepfake technology. So one more speculative use is through deepfake geography. This is kind of more of a hypothetical exercise that a bunch of researchers took to see if they could just deepfake a map. And what they did, you'll see in this image here that we have an image of Tacoma on the upper right-hand corner. And the researchers wanted to see if they could mash up images of Tacoma with another location. So on the bottom right or left, you'll see Tacoma as mashed up with Seattle, with some of the typical features of a Seattle landscape. On the bottom right, you'll see Tacoma through a Beijing filter. And looking at Beijing, you might think that this is a lower quality image than the others because of these large, boxy, dark shadows. But that's actually a reflection of the fact that Beijing's buildings are typically taller than those in Tacoma, so they're casting darker and deeper shadows. So what you're seeing is just a bunch of high rises dumped into the Tacoma landscape. So of course, this could be used for totally innocent purposes too. I have a friend who runs a D&D campaign in a fictionalized version of Pensacola. And so she could use technology like this to create a really cool fantasy Pensacola, like keeping the underlying layout of the streets, but superimposing new features onto the environment. But you really don't have to stretch your imagination too far to think about less ethical ways that this technology could be used. So you could have a country that really wants to obscure something sketchy going on within its borders and maybe altering satellite imagery to cover up whatever's going on the ground. That brings us to the current state of deepfakes and where we are right now. So much like with natural language generating technology, deepfakes are also more accessible than ever to the layperson as well. So while you probably need a pretty high skill set in order to create a convincing deepfake, if you want to create just a really shoddy slapdash one, it's very easy to do that. You can just Google create deepfake and you'll see numerous tutorials teaching you how to do that. However, it's even still easy for a lay person to get their hands on a more sophisticated deepfake because you can just find and pay someone to do it for you. There's a pretty active market for this. And so it's become a more democratized medium. More people have access to it. It's also become sophisticated to the point where it's not only more difficult for us to detect with the naked eye, but it's also more difficult for deepfake detection software to keep up. One thing that I saw a lot when I was just doing cursory Google searches of deepfakes and information technology is that people would provide these checklists for detecting a deepfake. And even ones that were generated fairly recently were already kind of out of date. So something that I saw on a lot of these lists was to look for blinking. And if the video did not blink, that was almost a surefire indicator that you are looking at a deepfake. But if you'll remember back to the example of the solo video that I shared earlier, Harrison Ford was blinking. That's no longer really a clear indicator over whether something's a deepfake or not. Same thing with detection software. There isn't really anything out there that can identify a deepfake with real statistical certainty. And in fact, most of the software that's out there has a serious problem with false positives, where they are identifying real videos as deepfakes. So it's kind of an ongoing cat and mouse game with improvements to deepfake technology and also detection software racing to try to catch up. Okay, so this brings us to the meat and potatoes of the presentation. We're discussing what this means for us as information literacy instructors and as librarians. So most of the technology that we've discussed so far it's very new. It's still developing very rapidly. So we still don't really know what its long-term impacts are going to be on the information ecosystem. And that doesn't stop people from guessing. I'm sure that you've all heard over the past year during the election cycle, people were really worried that deepfakes were going to play a big role in spreading misinformation during the election cycle, which thankfully didn't end up happening. But I think there's a general feeling that it's really only a matter of time, especially with how accessible a lot of this technology is becoming. So it's something that we need to consider.
Teresa?
Yeah?
Okay, I think you covered up the microphone for a second, so we didn't hear the last sentence that you just said.
Oh no, okay. It wasn't ultra important. I was just saying that there are some things that we need to keep this in mind in terms of our students' perspective of what kind of information landscape they're facing as they're foraging for information. So in terms of synthetic text, I think I already kind of touched on this when I mentioned that as of April, there were 300 plus apps that were based just on GPT-3 currently available in the market. And these apps are creating about an average of 4.5 billion words a day. So the market is about to be flooded with this AI-generated text. And of course, not all of it is going to be bad. Not all of it is going to be misinformation. But I would be surprised if people whose job it is to churn out just droves of misinformation did not take advantage of this technology. Instead of having to spend a whole day maybe writing 5 or 6 articles, you could just type in a paragraph and let the program do the rest of the work. So it's entirely possible that we're going to start seeing this mass generation of misinformation on a scale that we haven't seen before. And one thing that Liam's example really highlighted is that it's not that difficult to game Google's algorithm. with this technology. So just having a passing knowledge of search engine optimization and buzzwords that will get your page to float to the top and get more clicks and get more ad revenue or eyes on your screen, whatever your goal is, it wouldn't be too difficult to start getting this less quality information to start really floating to the top. And I think all of us have experience with students who are reluctant to click beyond the first page of Google search results. We might really need to start talking to them about how you can't necessarily always trust Google's algorithm to pick the best and most quality content for you and to display it on the first page. When it comes to deepfakes, what I thought of here was when I teach visual literacy, I really enjoy teaching visual literacy because it's kind of a challenge for students to break out of this idea that a photograph or a video documents reality, like exactly as it is. And you have to take a lot of time talking to them about how framing is important, what the camera holder chooses to include on the screen versus exclude is important, editing, post-production of the video is important in kind of guiding and manipulating what you think about the scene that you are viewing. And deepfakes have almost taken the pendulum and swung it entirely in the opposite direction, in that now you have this trump card of deepfakes that you can use to slap onto any video that you maybe don't agree with or that doesn't align with your worldviews. And this kind of casts all visual media into doubt. And it's already had real world implications. I don't know if you all heard about the near coup that happened in Gabon in 2019. President at the time, Ali Bongo, disappeared for a couple months. And when he reappeared in a video address to the country, his speech was really stilted. His face was moving in kind of unnatural ways. And what people did not know was that he had had a stroke. But just based on the weirdness of the video, the military assumed that he was dead and tried. So we also have examples at home as well. If you are like me and you have a sick, morbid fascination with QAnon and spend a lot of time lurking on their forums, you'll see that they'll pick apart videos of President Biden and they'll look for any kind of weird hand movement or head movement to try to say this video is a deep fake, Joe Biden is actually in Guantanamo, so on and so forth, and that this is just a deep faked image. So deepfakes have the ability, just by their existence, to kind of place a shadow of doubt over any visual media. Okay, so this leads us to how we address these developments in the classroom. And for the slide that I'm presenting right now is kind of hypothetical in that I haven't had a chance to teach this in the classroom yet myself. And it's more in line with what I hope to do in the fall. I'm wanting to partner with a computer science professor and maybe run an hour-long workshop on this, hopefully in person if we're able to do that. So these are my thoughts on how I would like to run that program. And I'd really like to start with hands-on experience here and give students the opportunity to kind of play with some of this technology. And I'm not talking about like spending a whole hour teaching students how to put Arnold Schwarzenegger's head on Danny DeVito's body or something like that. I would like to just start with something that they're already familiar with, like, for example, that cartoon face swapping app that we're seeing everywhere. Students might not realize that that is AI-powered technology. So maybe I would start with having them play with something like Deep Nostalgia, upload their own image, see how it gets animated, and then maybe ask them questions like, what kind of technology do you think fuels this ability to animate photos? How else could you see this being used? Have you seen this technology being used in other venues? What are some of the ethical implications of that? So kind of using hands-on experience as an entryway. I know that kind of falls more under digital literacy than under information literacy, but I think we've all seen a pretty solid intersection between those two skill sets, and that one can often lead naturally into the other. Just to use an example of a class that I have taught, on the Coming campus at UNG, we have an instructor who requires her students to make a podcast. And our part of it, beyond helping with research, we also run audio editing workshops. And as we teach students how to use Audacity or GarageBand, it also gives us a chance to talk about, like, oh, I see that you're importing media or importing audio from another source. Have you thought about copyright? Have you thought about fair use or Creative Commons? And so just introducing to students how to use something hands-on can often lead to conversations about information literacy skills and thinking critically about that technology. The second bullet point I have here is probably really obvious, but I felt like it needed to be said anyway, mostly for my own sake, because it's something that I'm pretty bad at myself, which is keeping my content up to date. I created a fake news workshop back in 2016, and I was guilty of kind of leaning on it for way too long without editing or updating it. And by 2019, I could see my students' eyes just glazing over because this content wasn't relevant to them anymore. It didn't speak to their real world experience. So I think it goes without saying, the more current and up to date our examples are, the more relevant they are to students, and the more they care about why they should learn them. And I also wanted to talk about ways that talking about artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence in particular can lead to some really new and interesting angles to addressing the framework. So, for example, if we're looking at information has value, I mentioned earlier that in order to train a natural language model, it takes an insane amount of computational power, and often at the expense of the environment, greenhouse emissions. And usually the countries that are hosting these algorithm training servers are countries like the Maldives that are most directly in danger from climate change. So the idea is talking with students about how information doesn't only have value, it also has a cost as well. If we look at the frame of authority is constructed and contextual, the idea of data poisoning fits really cleanly into that as well. I think a lot of students have this preconceived notion that AI is neutral and that their output is neutral, and they don't really consider the fact that we have to teach the AI using very human, very flawed data sets. And so talking to students about how just because something is generated by a computer doesn't mean it's neutral, that it's factual, that you can trust its content without fact checking it. And lastly, probably most importantly here, we're looking at the frame of searching as strategic exploration. Previously, when we were talking about deepfakes, I talked a little bit about how checklists don't really do much in helping our students identify deepfakes because the technology is changing too quickly. And so I really feel that the traditional models that we rely upon to teach the CRAP test don't really work as effectively if we're looking at AI generated content. And so I wish I could remember the name of this presenter. At GLC in 2019, there was a presenter talking about the Sift method as an alternative to radar and the CRAP test, and I kind of latched onto this. But I think that the Sift method is helpful because it's more strategy-based rather than checklist-based, and it's asking students to behave like a fact checker and go outside of the source itself to investigate the source. So the steps here are I mean, it's not a perfect acronym here. Anytime you have a whole sentence coming after the letter, it's not a great acronym. But the strength of the model, I think, remains. It's asking students to stop and not react in an immediate knee-jerk manner, to take time to investigate the source outside of the source itself and Google around, to find another source that's covering the same story to try to verify if they match up, and also to trace any claims that the article is making. So I think that it's really important for us to start moving in this direction of teaching students how to investigate the sources that they're looking at rather than for specific red flags to try to identify. Those are always shifting and changing. And the last point that I want to make, I have to thank my coworker, William Brogdon, for this brain flash, because while we were sitting around talking about this topic, he said, what does this mean for the concept of originality, for plagiarism? So if a student, so GPT-3, is licensed through Microsoft, I really wouldn't be surprised if future versions of Word had some kind of GPT-3 prompt that would allow us to, if we're feeling like writer's block, to write in a sentence and maybe get a prompt for what to write next. So if our students start having access to this kind of technology, it's really not that different from something like Grammarly. So Grammarly will, if you're writing in passive voice, it'll give you a different version of your sentence that's written in active voice. This is just kind of a step further than that. I don't think it's something that is out of line, but it also presents difficulty here with how much of your writing is original. Does this count as plagiarism? Who owns the copyright to a work that was created by AI? And there's all kinds of interesting implications for the way that we teach citations.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. Do you want to wrap up? This is Ellen, by the way. Sorry.
I am done.
Okay.
So now let's reference this slide. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And do we have any questions or comments that I missed?
Let's see.
I'm scrolling really quickly through the comments here. I would also love to hear if you have any experience teaching these concepts yourself in the classroom, if you have any tips on how to do this. If not, I will just type my contact information in the chat because I love talking about this stuff. So if you love talking about it too, please get in touch with me and we can converse.
Thank you, Teresa. I really enjoyed it. I have a lot to learn.
Great.